Happy Monday, everybody. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Good.
It's looking like summer. It's awesome.
It is. We're gonna have hours of daylight even after we finish up here. Give it a couple more minutes for folks to join in. We have these like 2-week gaps. I get a little bit off my count. So 1, 2, 3. Yeah, we got enough folks. We've hit quorum, which is great news. Right, well, it is 5:30. Got a full agenda tonight, so let's go ahead and get started. So like the nice lady just told us, this meeting is being recorded. It's also being live streamed and available on YouTube for folks after the meeting. And then please try to use the raise hand button before speaking. Tries to eliminate some crosstalk and folks interrupting. You can find it in the bottom of the screen under reactions, and there's a thing that says raise hand. And then just to set some expectations for tonight, I would like it if we could try to wrap up our term limits conversation in the first hour and then move through our council president conversation in the second hour. Don't want to rush folks, but we've already added 3 meetings. So thinking a little bit about just trying to move through things at a reasonable pace. So with that, let's review where we left off last time in term limits. All right, so here's my screen. So we had agreed as a group that to include term limits as a recommendation from this body on the updated charter. We also agreed that we wanted to keep the term limit clock at number of years / terms rather than a period of time. And then we agreed that partial terms for elected / served greater than 3 years apply to term limits. And the inverse, less than 3 years, not apply to term limits. And then we had also agreed to this elected / appointed language, removing the served language. Any questions about what we had agreed upon at our last meeting? Awesome. So looking again at where we left off. So these two kind of, they're pretty tied together topics. So one being the number of years and terms that folks would be elected or appointed to as the maximum for the term limits. And then the second question being, is there a distinction between serving as a councilor or mayor? So for example, if the term limit was 16 years, is that just you can only serve on city council for 16 years? Or would it be that you can only serve, or you can only be elected or appointed to 16 years on council? But 8 of those are maxed out on being a council person, and then 8 of those are maxed out on being a mayor. So we broke into 2 groups. Group 1 liked 16 or 2 terms of each role, so separating by roles. Although they also brought up the interesting question of what 14 years could look like. So thinking about especially when we consider those kind of off council seats, of which there will be 3 based on this group's recommendation. This would help not limit the number of years and terms that person may serve. And then in group 2, it was 12 years, Lake Oswego as the model, and then total terms last year and not divided by role. knowing that while mayors usually have served as counselors, not always, but often, not every counselor can serve as mayor. There just isn't, that's just not how math works. Margaret, please go ahead.
I just had a question on the visual. Is that at least the paper that you handed out, the Lake Oswego model is not 12 years. It actually could be 16 years, 8 years as a counselor and 8 years as a mayor. The 12 was with Tualatin and Wilsonville.
That's true. I do not remember exactly why Lake Oswego as the model was in there. Someone else does. Feel free to add in, but I'll just highlight that in yellow.
I think there was something else about Lake Oswego that people like. I mean, I don't know if it was the time or I just have a faint memory of that, Kim.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, Lake Oswego, it said, you may be elected to city office or a combination of such for a period not to exceed 8 years. And then that was for council person. Then the same language for mayor. So.
Right. I'll be elected to any elective office or any combination for, yeah. So it was, I think what they liked about the Lake Oswego model is it says that it's any combination of city offices. So it's not divided by role. So that was it. Although it was 8, not 12. And this group was making the distinction that they preferred 12. So a longer period than LACO.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we start at number of years and terms? So we're looking at a couple options. 12, 14, and 16 have been put on the table. Anyone want to start us off? Nathan, please.
So sorry, I actually have another question rather than a starting point. But so depending how we answer this question, the question on partial terms may become moot, correct?
It should not, because partial terms are about elected or appointed to a period of greater than or less than 3 years. So that wouldn't apply to this number of years of a term limit. So that's going to be held separately. So if someone was elected to a 2-year seat, that does not apply to term limits at all. So no matter what the number of years and terms are, those 2 years just won't count. Does that make sense?
I think so. I'm just having to readjust the calculus in my head.
Yeah. I can give you a real life example in a second, but first, Jason, please.
As a place to start, as I thought about sort of the myriad of problems that we all identified coming out of the last session, we kind of left, I felt like, with a lot of problems without solutions on some of this. I really do think that just separating the roles entirely and having it be 8 years, which means that for someone in continuous office, they could either be in office a maximum, and this could only be one person at a time that did this. So it's not like the whole council would be like this, and everybody should think about that. But I really think separating them and having the effective term limit be either 16 or 14, so it wouldn't be defined in the charter. It would just say you can serve 8 and 8. And if someone ended up resigning early to run, they could do that and serve for 14 would typically be the way that worked out. Or if they were on the same cycle, they would be able to serve 16 maximum. I think that may be the best place we can get to. And I guess I just wanted to put that out there as a way to think about this and to just not get it overly complicated. And also, just as a reminder, most people won't be able to serve more than 8 years. There's only one mayor.
Thank you, Jason. Margaret, please.
Actually, I kind of like the Beaverton language. The one thing that in this discussion that we're talking about with term limits is that I don't like the idea that it's like forever. And, there was a city that was just to the south of us that had a mayor forever. And that's when they finally came in with term limits. But I actually kind of like the Beaverton language because I think it's very clear. It also goes through and defines, and that can change the year, what a partial term is and where a partial term does not count as part of the term. And it just seemed pretty clear, yet it does have, on this one, it's a 12-year limit. So.
Yeah, and just to clarify for everyone, Beaverton says that you can serve 3 consecutively elected terms as a councilor and then 3 consecutively elected terms as a mayor. And yeah, so it's 12 years in each. So you could serve for up to a maximum of 24. Yes, John, please.
Yeah, that's where I was going, was 24 years. If we're going to have term limits, I think 24 is just not a number that everybody's happy with. So I'm really not happy with the Beaverton model. The other thing is I would have loved to have been mayor for 12 years, but I think the size of our city and the burnout factor, I don't think that's realistic to do it for 12 years. So just as one position. So actually, I agree more or less what Jason said of dividing it up where it's no more than 8 at any one and no more than either 14 or 16, depending on where they ended up in the cycle on 2.
Okay, this is Margaret. Sounds good.
All right, I'm hearing some agreement so far around splitting it up and 8 and 8. And Lindsay, you are nodding your head, but please speak.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm definitely feeling this suggestion because I think, you know, someone serving a total of 16 years, if it happens to work out that they're a counselor and a mayor, great for them. I would not feel comfortable if they were mayor for 16 years. So I think it is helpful to separate it out and actually, you know, I think originally we were going to group it together because that made it easier. But the way that Jason stated this, I actually think this is clear. And then I think that kind of gets away with like not having to deal as much with the partial terms as well. So I'm in favor of this new approach.
Yes. See, John, I'm going to skip you because Carol hasn't spoken yet.
Hi. Yeah, I like the 8 and 8, the 2 terms. And, you know, of course, keeping that partial terms don't count.
Thanks, Carol. And Karen, please.
I was just going to say the opposite. 8 and 8 is great, but when I was voting on the more than 3 years apply to a term, I was only thinking of a term because now we're back to it's 8 and 8, but then you could have +3 if we throw that in, and I don't want to add 3 to the 16. So
Yeah. So the times where it would be, so you could add most of the time it would be +2. Because often it's that someone has resigned from a council seat to run, at least up to this point, usually someone has resigned from a council seat to run for mayor. And so that you do end up at 18 in that case. Or actually you wouldn't end up at 18, you would end, yes, you would, sorry. John, please.
2 things. I want to follow up on that, but first I want to state, on the 8 and 8, if you think of neighboring electeds that are fitting that right now is Mayor Callaway served 8 on the council, and now he's Mayor of Hillsborough for his 8th year. And then Mayor Bubanek of Tualatin served 8 on the council, and now he's serving his second 4-year term on the council or as mayor. So examples of really close local cities. Back to the other, I get what Karen's saying. I don't know how we make that all work out. It could lengthen. It doesn't usually happen. It's usually 2 years, like you said, Kim. So it could add 2 years onto anything. It can happen for more, but it hasn't happened yet that way. So I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but it's usually not going to pop up. So.
Yeah. And I think, John, to your point, it's there's going to be some weird off-ball kind of situations that could happen, but thinking more about what's most likely and most common and what we've seen so far in Tigard's history.
Well, the other thing is, I think we need to clarify, and I don't know if it's now or if it's what's coming up next, is we need to clarify the point is, do you have to resign to run for mayor? And I think that point plays into this thing we're talking about right now. So to me, that should almost be decided on before we finish this discussion.
That was actually my point, Kim, too.
Yeah. So
that's the main reason this happens.
So it's interesting because whether or not someone resigns for mayor, I guess if they resign and then run for mayor and they aren't elected, then this would be more applicable. But if they would have to resign anyway from their council seat in order to be the mayor, so that this doesn't really apply as much.
Yes and no. Agree and disagree. Agree to disagree.
Tony, please.
Sorry, having a challenge unmuting. Yeah, I kind of see that same point where you could end up having somebody that's in there for 18 years instead of 16. And I do agree that needing to resign before you run for mayor, because that I could see where that could potentially happen more than once. Because if you resign from your city council position and run for mayor, you fail your mayor bid, and then you get reelected to city council, and then you do that cycle again. If your partial terms don't count to your city council total, you could end up, serving 1 year term on or 2 year terms or whatever kind of. I mean, if that, however that cycle is. But also, what happens if the mayor doesn't finish out their term? Is that an appointment or is it a special election? Because that kind of could create that dynamic for the mayor also.
Let's clarify something. If someone resigns from their seat and they only serve 2 years, if they were elected to a 4-year term, then the entire 4 years still counts against their term limit. So someone cannot resign in order to reset that. It can't resign and get 2 more years back if they were elected to a 4-year term or any term greater than 3 years. So that is something that we want to keep in mind when we're talking about some of these hypotheticals. Margaret, please.
Actually, I was kind of responding to John's thing. I don't think it's a good idea to have to resign to run for mayor, for example. I think that on something like this, if somebody's run in 2, and usually it's going to be a 2-year term, it's going to be in the middle. You can always either, whether it's an election cycle or you can appoint, and that I think that needs to be in the charter. But I think maybe that might discourage some people from running for mayor. So I don't think any other jurisdiction around us has that rule.
No.
And I know that it was a big kerfuffle earlier. And so I think that it's just when they resign, either depending on how the charter comes out, someone is appointed to fill the term if it's less than 2 years, or they have to be elected in whatever the election is, something like that.
Right. So I'm going to cut off that conversation around the resignation and vacancies and how vacancies are filled, because we are going to get to those next. And thinking about it, when we talk about someone who is running for mayor and then is elected to that seat, it doesn't cut off. It doesn't affect their term limits really in any way, because they can't hold both seats at the same time, except that we may want to think about offsetting the term limits from a even number from an even multiple of 4 to a multiple of 2, because that will address the folks who may have to resign in order, or basically have a term cut off and then run for mayor. But let's not talk about the resignation requirement and whether we enjoy it or not, because that's not as relevant as the fact that there are 3 seats who are councilors whose terms do get cut off if they choose to run for mayor before the end of their term. All right, Nathan, please.
Sorry, another question. And I feel like it's been months since we've met, so I'm feeling a little out of sorts, but I don't remember if the question of what counts as resetting the term clock is part of the vacancies discussion, or if that was part of this discussion.
It's generally what resets the term clock is an election cycle. So it would be 2 years, usually.
That usually makes me nervous.
But we talked about it, isn't it, Kim?
You're right. I mean, there is the weird possibility of your time as an elected official ends, you've hit your term limit, someone else steps in and they resign after 6 months for whatever reason. So then there's a special election and then you're elected to a seat. And so it's less than 2 years. That would be odd, super strange. John, I see you having thoughts.
Well, I was just going to say it relates to, it does relate, and I agree with Nathan, is whether that person's appointed or elected, I still think there needs to be some kind of total term limits. You know, if all of a sudden Heidi resigned right now, could they appoint Jason again? I think the point we discussed that Jason just mentioned is we said, no, it has to be a 2-year vacancy. So you can't appoint somebody or they can't run for 2 years. And that was what we discussed. So somewhere in here, we need to get that written in there.
Okay. I don't recall that as part of our discussion. We can certainly add that in. Okay.
I think it became the language because of some of the rewriting of language by Shelby. I don't remember it being structured in like we put it on a form. It was more like what the work Shelby was doing to rewrite things, I thought.
Yeah, I think it's come across before as being an election cycle was generally the language, like an election cycle had to break it up, which would almost always be 2 years.
Right.
And that's generally the language, but we can talk about that too. But first, let's go back to term limits under ordinary circumstances. So what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of agreement around dividing the term limits based on roles. So X number of years as a counselor, X number of years as mayor. Is there anyone who feels very strongly against that division? Hearing none, does everyone agree to divide by roles? Yeah, great. I'm just gonna share that. So let's update this. All right, and now the second, much more thorny question has to do with number of years and terms. So what I was hearing pretty overwhelmingly from the group, outside of what are some of the odder circumstances, and we talked about 2 kind of odd circumstances that could come up. One being someone gets elected or reappointed very soon after they have hit their term limits. And 2 being someone ends up with just a lot of years in a row because they've gotten appointed multiple times for less than 3-year terms and some other weird circumstances. So let's table both of those kind of odd things that could happen that we can address in the charter and just talk about kind of the usual case of events when someone will either be serving like 2 terms in a row as counselor and trying to serve 2 terms in a row as mayor thereafter, or serve 1.5 terms as a counselor because of you can't serve as 2 positions at the same time. And so they would have to break their second term in order to then run for or be elected to mayor and serve as mayor for then 2 terms. So that will lead them to be 4 + 2, 6 + 8, so 14 years instead of the 16. So does anyone feel very strongly that it shouldn't be 8 and 8? So is everyone in agreement on 16 years total, but really that being broken as 8 and 8? And Karen, please.
Well, maybe you just said it, that I want to make sure that that means that the whole partial term conversation that we had doesn't apply.
It does. So if someone was appointed or elected to a 2-year term, then they would technically be able to serve whichever side that was. So if they were appointed to a 2-year council seat, elected to a 2-year council seat, then they could serve 10 years as a counselor and then serve 8 years as a mayor.
And I'm not in favor of that. So
Jason,
know.
please.
Let's just talk about how unusual of a situation that would be. So let's walk it through as someone that's just a counselor. So that would mean that someone, if that were to happen, someone could serve 10 years as a city councilor. If they somehow got appointed to a 2-year term and then served 8 years as a city councilor in elected office, and they were on the right cycle to then go 8 years as a mayor, they could theoretically, one person, if all those stars aligned, could serve 18 years. So we're talking about what I think of as a pretty extreme edge case. And I don't personally want to make the majority of our decisions that I think are important on those kind of extreme edge cases where the difference is so negligible. If we were talking about the difference between 16 and 24, okay, maybe, but like we're talking about an infrequent situation where it can only happen with one person with all the stars aligning. I just don't think it's worth a lot of effort trying to mitigate that one thing that will be infrequent.
Thank you, Jason. Zachary, please.
Yeah, kind of similar to what Jason said. I feel like, yeah, all the stars would have to align, and it would be, still a public figure. So you'd have to get elected, and it would be pretty difficult to get that much crowd base. But even then, like, normally it'd be like 16 years max, 18 if you're lucky type of deal. So it is pretty minimal. And 16 years, it seems like a while, but it does, go by kind of fast too. So it depends.
Thanks, Zachary. And Tony, please.
So I guess part of my question around this is, what does this mean with the appointments? It sounds more like if someone else doesn't finish out their term, or they, something happens, they leaves, then a person could be appointed for the remainder of whatever that open term is, or for 2 years, and that could happen. That seems like something that more likely happen, that someone would be appointed to a position and then be elected or have been elected. Because a lot of times the people that are with the mayor's office, the city councils, people, people who would actually be available to step into a position. And there's a chance that that person could have already served their full city council, their full mayor time, and then they could just be appointed to finish out someone else's cycle. I think that, to me, that kind of seems like a more plausible scenario. And that, I think, still falls, I'm in agreement with Karen that I think the spirit of what people want with term limits, that would still kind of be, kind of gets in that buddy network kind of thing, where people that they're your friends, and you've served 16 years with them, and then you say, hey, I've got a vacancy, come in and fill it for another couple of years. I think that's kind of what people are wanting to avoid. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, because one of our next topics is exactly that, which is how are vacancies filled and what discretion is given to the council. And a couple of examples that we showed some examples where, I think the LOC example encourages the appointment side, whereas the Beaverton example requires elections. So I think when we get to that filling of vacancies, that's going to also dovetail really nicely with this conversation. So thanks for bringing that up, Tony. And Lindsay, and I think then we might have a break.
Just kind of to reiterate a little bit what Zachary was saying, is that these are elected positions. So if someone serves for 16 years, that's actually 4 election cycles that they have to be voted on. And, of course, statistics show that the incumbent, has a better chance and all of that. But at the same time, ultimately, at some point, this is how our democracy works, and you have to leave it in the hands of the local community. And if people don't vote and participate, that's, a little bit on them. That's just how it works. So I think, if someone is elected in 4 different cycles, happy for them to serve that 16 years. And then if there's a one-off appointment that happens, it's a big deal to have been voted on 4 different cycles and election cycles. And that's a whole different generation of people that's voting now. And so I'm I'm happy with the adding the extra 2 years if that edge case kind of is the scenario that we do ultimately kind of need to leave this up to voters too, to decide who they want in office. That's up to them to vote.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it back to the electorate, Lindsay. And Jason, please.
So I'm clear, and maybe I'm not super clear on this, but if someone were appointed at the end of their 16 years, the way we have this written now, they could not be appointed for more than 2. Is that right?
If someone had served 16 years and then there is any break in service, so their term ends on December 31 and they're for some reason the next person doesn't show up by January 10th to fulfill their requirements like they're supposed to, and the position was appointed on January 11th, then until we talk about the next weird edge case, which would be what is that length of break of service that we're requiring, then technically right now they could be appointed, but then they would be appointed for a term
that's longer than 3 years. That's what I'm getting. Yeah.
Yeah, but there would be technically a break in service. So we need to talk about a required break in service, which will be our very next question. John. Oh, no.
That was basically what I was going to say is until we talk about break in service, that case, we can clear that up with break in service. We don't need to clear that up in the election years.
Thank you. So here's the question as I see it right now. Happy to take any edits. So does the committee recommend limiting terms to 8 years as councilor and 8 years as mayor? And then a yes vote would say yes, recommend that limitation, and no, do not recommend that limitation. And just to remind everyone, the current charter language is 8 and 8 for a maximum of 12 combined. So if we can't find agreement today in a couple of votes, and I'm going to say we're going to hold it to at most 3 different variations, then we will default to that current language and move along. So if anyone would like to call this question, or if anyone would like to offer a different question.
I make a motion to consider this as it's written.
Second.
Thank you. Carol Krager.
Yes.
Derek Lawson.
Yes.
Jason Snyder.
Yes.
Councillor Shaw is not with us. John Cook.
Yes.
Karen Emerson.
No.
Lindsay Murphy.
Yes.
Margaret Doherty.
Yes.
Nathan Jackson.
Yes.
Tony Simpson.
I'm gonna say no.
And Zachary Claremont.
Yes.
All right, as a vote of 8 to 2 or 10 voting members, this does pass. So this will be the committee recommendation for 8 and 8. Now let's talk about required break in service. I have heard 2 years. Does anyone feel differently that a 2-year requirement for break of service before term limits start again? Before you are allowed to serve as an elected official, whether appointed, elected, nominated by some other weird body that might exist. Does everyone feel good with a 2-year break in service? Required 2-year break in service? Great, great. So we had one other weird edge case, and I've been moving so fast that I forgot to take a note of what that was. So if someone could remind the group. Shall we?
I'm checking my notes. I
think Jason had brought up the potential where someone could be appointed to a position on the tail end of their fulfilling the term limits, and that if there was more than 2 years remaining on that appointed term, then they may not be able to complete it, if I understood the issue correctly. And that's what you're referring to.
I raised that issue, but I don't know if that's what Kim is talking about.
I don't know. Well, Jason, do you want to bring up that? Is that an issue you'd like to discuss next? I think maybe we move along from term limits, and then if this comes up again around resignation requirement, we can come back. John, go ahead.
I was going to say, if we have a 2-year break in service, it's a moot point. You can't appoint somebody for the next 2 years afterwards.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. That tracks.
I mean, if that's what we're meaning by the 2-year break in service, is that what we meant?
I thought that's what we meant, but I'm to clarify it.
So I thought I meant, are there any other, so we've heard about some concerns that because you could be appointed to 2 years or elected to 2 years and then theoretically maybe serve out 18, that could be a concern. But that came up in the vote. And so that one was addressed, and then we've addressed the break in service. Jason, please.
Yeah, I mean, as I think about this, and again, we go back to what actually occurred to Tigard in the late 90s, early 2000s, where we had 2 mayors in a row die in office in a very short period of time. You know, that might be a time where you do actually want to appoint a prior mayor who had served and maybe wouldn't meet the criteria for, I don't know. I guess I always worry about the, giving a complete lack of flexibility during a time of, I don't know if I'd call that a crisis, but it certainly was not an ideal time in Tigard's history in the mayor's office. And it probably would have been better to not be tying the hands of people around trying to deal with that. But maybe there's enough options that it doesn't matter. I'm genuinely curious to hear what others think about that.
John, please.
I was going to say, luckily they weren't in a row, the 2 deaths, and both times death happened, the council decided to appoint, and both times there was 3 the first time that applied, and there were 8 the second time that applied. They were non-councilors. The councilors decided they didn't want to appoint one of the councilors to mayor, and they made that decision before they decided to put it out to everybody else. Each one of them were a little different on how they wanted to handle it. The very first one, they actually did not want the person they appointed to be able to run for the next election cycle. So it was very interesting the way both of those happened. One of them was a very short term, the other one was a little longer. It's very unique. I think it proves the point, and I'll only state this now, but it's something we're going to talk about, the appointed versus the elected. And I think that's when that comes up, and I'll talk more about it when we talk about that again. But I really have no problem. In the last 2 appointments, they didn't look to see, and let's grab somebody that was just mayor before. They went to the public in general and just said, please apply and we'll apply and appoint. When I was elected, the council decided to throw it out for election, but they had the choice that they could have appointed. So I think that, to me, that's council's choice. I don't think it's something we need to worry about right now for this term limit part.
Oh, they gave a really good summary for when we get to how vacancies are filled. And Jason, to your point, we could always put an exception how vacancies are filled about term limits, and especially in case of. So, but in the interest of moving forward, let's talk about something completely different, and council president. So let's just talk, before I pull up any slides, about what the general principle of the council president is. Essentially, they are there to serve as the mayor in either a meeting format or another official format if the mayor is unavailable. I think that's pretty much the 2-sentence description of it. Jason or John, anything that you care to add to how that role works?
I would state, the charter, I think, does a good job of explaining it now. I really have no problem with it. The problem I had is one of the council presidents tried to make it a associate mayor position or an adjutant mayor, or however else you want to call it, versus a council president. And they requested to be in on every meeting I attended so that if I died that day, that they would be able to step in. And that's not the way it's written. And I don't feel that that's the way it should be. And so I'm actually fine the way it's written now, and it worked fine for my 6 years, with the exception of the 2 years where I was struggling the whole 2 years with somebody trying to basically take over my job.
How dare you say that about me?
Your 4 years were fine. I'm talking the other 2.
I know.
So that is a good point. The council president is not the vice mayor. That is a very different role if we're looking at like the federal government kind of equivalency.
I would just add that I think it might be helpful to maybe elaborate a little bit on the role, perhaps. I mean, I think the general gist that John described is kind of the main deal, but I think it might be a little bit more, it might be helpful to maybe provide a little more detail around some points. So that would be my only comment. I don't know that that's a deal breaker or anything, but the role, I mean, saying just two sentences about it left a lot to be figured out in people's heads, I would say.
Well, please elaborate, as I think you might be the only one in this room who actually served as the council president.
That's probably true. I mean, I think the main responsibilities are described, but there are times when the mayor's gone, there really maybe wasn't a lot of clarity. I mean, the general sense was if the mayor became incapacitated and there was an emergency, but that even wasn't really spelled out, I don't think, very clearly. So I think there's situations where it should probably be clear that in any instance where the mayor is either unavailable or incapacitated, that in the interim, the council president would, perform the duties of the mayor until the council can meet and figure something else out. I don't know, but that's probably one. And then I also think it might be worth saying that the council president can and should also represent the city anytime the mayor basically asks them to or directs them to give a little more flexibility and direction there as well.
Great. So here is the language for how it is currently written. And I did that thing where I read all the other cities in Oregon who have greater than 20,000 population to kind of see if Tigard's is about what other folks are doing or a little bit different. So Tigard's language says, in the mayor's absence from a council meeting, the president shall perform the duties of the office of mayor and preside over it. So we talked about the mayor's duties in terms of a meeting before, which is things like approve the agenda, maintain order, act as the facilitator of that meeting. And then whenever the mayor is physically or mentally unable to perform the functions of office, the president shall act as the mayor pro tem. What is a little bit different in a lot of other charters, wow, that word took a while to find, is that it's a little less prescriptive in the second sentence. So the first sentence is about what everybody has. The second sentence usually says whenever the mayor is unable to perform the functions of office, the president shall act as the mayor pro tem, and is left very vague on what unable means. And what in this case that would leave that clarification to council and to the mayor. John, please.
Yeah, if you look back in history, because I guess that's what my role is, there's been 3 mayor pro tems, and they were council presidents that took the place of the mayor while they were either waiting for the election or while they were waiting for the appointment. They took the term mayor pro tem, but because there was no mayor there. The mayor had either resigned or died or something. I think having it there doesn't bother me because to me, it will only come up. I mean, it's come up 3 times in history. Mayor Bishop resigned and then we had 2 mayors die. So that's the only 3 times in history it's actually come up. So I think leaving it there is fine, but I don't like the fact, I wouldn't want to expand to when the council president doesn't always become mayor pro tem. because the council can decide when we get to that discussion to maybe appoint some other counselor to be mayor. So what I don't want this to do is say that the council president automatically becomes the mayor.
Right, because it's not a vice mayor. So I don't want to wordsmith the current language because we probably will modernize it in some ways. But if there's conceptually any changes that folks would like to request, for instance, making it a little more open or adding something, and Jason, please.
Yeah, I mean, the way it is written now, I guess I'll just reemphasize the point that I feel like it is a little restrictive. I understand John's point about the second sentence, and that's fine. Like, I don't think the person should automatically become the mayor pro tem, but I do, or become the mayor, I should say. But I do think that the first sentence is pretty overly restrictive. Like, it's limited to basically presiding and managing council meetings. And there's just a lot more that goes on than just council meetings that the mayor may need the council president to represent the city at or go to, or, you know, it can be very formal things to very ceremonial things and everything in between. And I just think it should be a little broader to make that more clear. So I guess when Shelby and I have been talking about this before this meeting, we thought the second sentence is what addressed your concerns that you're bringing up, because we spent a lot of time talking about what are the functions of the office. So things like doing ceremonial, showing up to things, doing ceremonial ribbon cuttings. Thank you, John. Signing resolutions, making proclamations. Do you not feel that the second sentence, and especially that term functions of office, covers that? Basically, do you not feel like the second sentence covers those offices? Well, I mean, the way it's currently functioning, or the way that's written to me right now, I mean, there's the physically or mentally unable to perform the function. So that's one part that I know you're talking about changing, but it says that the president shall then act as the mayor pro tem. And what I'm suggesting is something fairly, at least in my mind, is somewhat different, which is, okay, whenever the mayor is unable to perform the functions, we're not asking the president to act as the mayor pro tem. We're asking him to go fulfill whatever duties are needed to be done. I guess I just don't think those are the same thing, but maybe they are. No, that's a good point. Thank you. Shelby, please. Also, Shelby, you can interrupt me.
Oh, wait. So, Jason, to that point, if we said something like, it almost sounds like in other duties as assigned, as requested by the mayor, does something like that address?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just make it clear that during normal functioning of the city and the count, because a lot of the way this one is, it's almost like a catastrophe kind of language where there's a lot of things to do during normal functioning times where the mayor can't get to something for whatever reason, or get to a meeting, or occasionally we did it even for strategic reasons. Like I had either a better relationship or more of a relationship with some group, or John and I had different styles, and he's a little more generally a little more easygoing and conflict avoidant, and he would say that. I think he would say that about himself. And so there were a few times where we made that choice, like we need this tactic to get what we want.
Yeah, and I think if we leave it as requested by the mayor, that avoids the potential conflict that John was saying, where if the mayor loses all discretion, then now we have the council president and mayor potentially vying for the same thing. So ultimately, the mayor will pick the roles or the duties for the council president. I think that works.
So let's talk about just this one concept. I see that there's a lot of hands. And if your hand is up for this concept, physically raise your hand. Around adding a sentence or adding something that basically addresses that there are other mayor's duties that you wouldn't necessarily be a mayor pro tem, but that could be performed by the council president at the request of the mayor. Do any of the hands up address that? Okay, Zachary, go. Margaret, see your hand, but Zachary is going to go and then you.
Okay, so you're gonna ask me what I think about it, or you just
Well, so that's the topic that we're now honing in on. So if that was why your hand was up, that was, yeah. So go ahead.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I feel like, yeah, that's a good way to look at it, because I mean, that way the mayor doesn't lose full power, because if, you know, but then again, how also do they prove that the mayor is physically or mentally unable to perform the task? I mean, I know physically if they don't show up, right? But like, what would mentally be like? Do they have like a testing for that?
Yeah, so we'll get into that too with vacancies. There's adjudicated incompetence is a potential, is generally considered a creating a vacancy. But it could also be at the mayor's discretion if they're, you know, just not able to do that day. But Margaret, please.
I think what this was is are we talking about two different things? One, the idea of replacing a mayor or putting somebody in for a while, and then also the second thing of having the mayor let the council president do duties as assigned.
Yeah, that's the concept right now, is
Okay.
basically putting it into the charter that the mayor can request of the council president to go out and handle what would have otherwise been a mayoral office.
And I like that.
Okay. Does anyone else have thoughts, concerns, opposition to this language around other duties as assigned as requested by the mayor? Nathan, please.
It's not a concern so much as a question. I'm not sure I do understand the distinction between mayor pro tem and acting in the stead of the mayor. So maybe someone can clarify that for me.
Shelby, do you want to take that one on?
So the distinction is basically if the mayor is either dies in office or resigns prior to the end of their term, there needs to be an interim until that full vacancy is filled. And so the mayor pro tem will be that interim filler. A vice mayor or an acting mayor would basically automatically assume the full office. And that's not what we're saying. So basically, this is just the distinction that it's an interim time filler until either appointment or election of the real full-time mayor.
So is there like a widespread legal understanding that pro tem implies incapacitation, or is that something we're just applying ourselves?
So it's not just tied to incapacitation, but it is pro tem is different than a permanent automatic assumption of power.
It's sort of like a de facto, like someone's got to do it because this thing just happened that nobody expected, but it's not going to, there's no expectation it'll continue, Nathan. I think that's the maybe part of the distinction.
To go back to kind of our federal government, sometimes the president, if they're going under for surgery, will temporarily write over the powers of president to the vice president, knowing that they're going to come out of, they're likely, hopefully, to come out of that surgery after the fact. So that would be something similar. All right. Any other questions about the concept? Margaret. Margaret, you're muted.
I think to make it a little clearer, I mean, if you look at the definition of what, tempore is it means for the time being. And so, I don't know if that's actually, in Black's Law Dictionary or whatever, but every time I've seen somebody that's been a pro tem, it's been for the time being. Whatever that time is up to interpretation, but so.
But time being in the sense that the mayor can't. Not that the mayor wants them to do something.
Yeah, I think that would be the distinction.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nathan.
Right. Anyone opposed to adding this concept of at the mayor's request other duties as assigned? Everyone's okay with that? Nods. Great. So we will go ahead with that concept. And Derek, please introduce our next one.
I just wanted to ask what the group's appetite would be for including in the charter, like a time frame that a person would act, like at the same time that we're expanding the number of counselors to 6, perhaps setting the time that somebody might serve in this capacity to like 1 year. which would give more people an opportunity to experience the role. That's kind of what I was thinking about.
You are absolutely on the right track, and that is exactly our next question as soon as we finish talking about what the role is. I literally have my next slide ready. Thank you. Tony, please.
My question is whether this concept comes in here or it comes in later, and that's who decides when the mayor isn't mentally or physically able to do their duties. I mean, what is that criteria? We have the language that says if they're not able to, who gets to decide that? So I'm in favor of the mayor being able to ask the president to be able to perform tasks, because that would be a collaboration. But if there's a conflict between the council or the president and the mayor, if there's no written guideline of what that criteria is, the president could just take over and say, you're not mentally able to do it because I don't like the clothes you wear. I mean, they could just have whatever their criteria is.
Right. So that's where we get into the concept of adjudicated incompetence, which creates a vacancy. So that I believe that will address this concern. Shelby, is there some nuance I'm missing?
Well, so I think there's the difference between when is the mayor permanently unavailable and when is the mayor not available for purposes of a particular meeting. And so that gets to the point that Kim was making earlier about to the extent we make recommendations, our request would be to clarify that we're talking the filling in of a council president is really when the mayor is unavailable. It's not when the mayor is incapacitated or deceased or whatever. So that, especially with hybrid meetings now, physically unavailable is not as relevant as it used to be. We've had counselors participate from out of state and foreign countries of our council meetings so far. And so being remote or being physically in Tigard is not necessary anymore. And then that gets to the mentally unavailable. I agree. I share the concern that that's not a defined term. That's not anything. And so I think what we're talking about is separating, are they unavailable for purposes of being on this meeting? Are they on vacation and just don't want to chair this meeting? Or are they somehow unable to, for really serious reasons, are they unavailable to participate? So I think we're looking at those two separate instances. The vacancies, I think we should table until the vacancy discussion, because we're not talking about when the mayor is deceased or otherwise. We'll say moved out of state as opposed to deceased, something more positive. So we're not talking about when the mayor moves out of state. We're talking about when the mayor is on vacation out of state. So I think we need to clarify those two situations.
Yeah, I think it goes back to these, this is what I think Shelby and I talked about prior to this meeting, that this sentence of physically or mentally unable is both a little broad and a little too narrow. And in most charters, it's either the word unavailable or unable. Zachary, please.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about before. Kind of wondering about the full scope of that is, because like if the mayor like was just having a rough day, like and they're like, oh, I have some sort of thing or something, like is there a limit to how many times they could call in a sub, or is it just like whatever is convenient? Or
so we're really dovetailing into how vacancies are created. So vacancy could be created, and we could write this into the charter as being absent for so long from city duties. And that would be more where you would, in that question, you would go more towards a vacancy is created rather than a council president, because you would call in the sub so many times and then you would create the vacancy and then follow through on whatever the vacancy fill process is. Is anyone opposed to us changing this language to something around like unavailable, unable?
I mean, my part is out, Kim, the way you're proposing that, the suggestion that they also can be delegated? No.
No, both of these would be in. So the delegated would stay or would be added, and then this would be changed. Cool. Anybody else? Anybody opposed? Great. So Derek already got us really well started on term length. So again, went back and read all of the charters, and I hadn't seen anything like this before. Of the 29 cities that I've been reading with populations greater than 20,000, 16 of them have 1-year terms, 13 of them have 2-year terms. And if you add Tigard in there, it is 16 to 14, almost a dead even split. And so there are positives and negatives to both sides. Derek, I would love it if you would care to restate your point around 1 year, if you had anything you wanted to add. So I know you kind of got us, you jumped off with it.
I think it dovetails neatly with what John was talking about. He had a puppy dog trail him for 2 years. And, but the nicer side of it is just to give people an opportunity to serve in the capacity. So if you limit it to 1 year, we have more counselors now, more people could enjoy it, more diversity of thought. That was my only thought on it as I was considering it over the weekend.
Thanks, Derek. Shelby, so Counselor Shaw wasn't able to join us this evening, but she did have thoughts on the 1 year versus 2 year. And I would encourage anyone else who may not be able to make future meetings, I know over our summer meetings, that if you have thoughts on a specific topic that you would like to share, you're always free to email them to Shelby and I, and we'll share them with the group, even though you won't be able to vote. So Shelby, if you'd like to share Counselor Shaw's thoughts.
Yes, so she did write to express that she said, given we no longer gauge council presidency on experience, 2 years is no longer needed or warranted. Besides here and at council, when an item comes, oh, sorry, that was next. She suggested be 1 year as an opportunity to serve. And then she echoed what Derek said. She said 1 year makes sense, shares the duties, the workload, and enables another perspective and educational opportunity for a counselor to participate and learn more. And if the will of the council is to vote that counselor in again for a second term, they can. So she proposed no limits on the number of times that they can be voted in, but to separately vote each year.
John, please.
That's basically where I was going to go, was the term limits on that is 2 year term versus a 1 year term. You know, back to my first year, I would have loved to have seen a 1 year term. But allowing them to be voted back in by the counselors, because that's who the counselors want, I think that's more important to me than a 1 year term or a 2 year term. So I don't want to limit the council presidency to term limits.
Thanks, John. And I should also, I don't think we explicitly stated this, though it does explicitly say this in the charter, and this is kind of how everyone does it, which is that the council president is not like an elected position from the electorate. It is selected by counselors. Karen, please.
Well, I'm going to bring in the school board model. Definitely want it to be 1 year for all of the opportunity reasons. But I do like the idea of no more than 2 years in a row. And that is how we do it on the school board. John said no limits, but
Karen, is that for the chair or for the vice chair?
Vice chair. And I'm viewing the president as like vice chair of, because that's the role they're going to fill, is the chairing part. Yeah, so it's vice chair once a year, or for 1 year at a time, and no more than 2 years consecutively. And I also really want to get rid of the ballot part. Back to that. It's the ballot language, that it not be by ballot.
I need to go look at the charter again.
I'm really hoping that it can be, because there's no way that doing it the ballot way isn't creating serial meetings happening before the actual vote meeting.
So the way it works is that, and Carol can talk to this also, So it is a written ballot. It's not a secret ballot. And so it's not a serial meeting because it does take place at the public meeting. And it's not a secret vote because everyone puts their name on it when they vote. And so anyone could make a public records request for the outcome of those votes. It's just not announced publicly at the meeting itself.
Yes, but nobody wants to elect somebody who doesn't want the position. So I know that there's discussions in advance of who is interested in being elected. And it should be nominated during the meeting. The nomination should be accepted. And then it should be voting on all of the nominees.
Thanks, Karen. All right, so we've got three separate questions in this case. One is the length of the term, 1 or 2 years. The second is whether or not to term limit the number of successive terms. And the third would be changing how the election of the council president is handled. So why don't we start with the first question, because I think there was a lot of consensus around this one, that to amend the council presidency term from 2 years to 1 year. Does anyone feel strongly to stay with 2 years? So everyone's good with one? Hold up a finger. Yeah. All right. Cool. So we have then recommended a change to the charter for 1 year. So let's talk about term limiting that position. So a single counselor serves 4 years, typically, and a council, so the same group of 5 to be 7 with these charter amendments, serves 2. So just going back to the idea of term limits, John, please.
I was going to say, I don't like term limits within that. The council is the ones that have to live with whoever's the person running the meeting. And therefore, they're the ones deciding who that person is that's running that meeting. And so whether that counselor is council president for 8 years, because the council had faith and, trust in that person, the way they run the meeting, when the mayor's not there. First of all, the mayor's not there that often. So it's not that big a deal to me. And secondarily is when they're not there, when it occasionally happens, if the rest of the council decides that they feel that person is the best person available, for not only that, but doing the other duties that, Jason talked about, maybe the ribbon cuttings, the showing up at the chamber board or whatever it is, then I feel that the council needs to have some say in that. And the public really shouldn't override that, because to me, they don't know the ins and outs of the workings of what's going on behind the scenes of that.
Thanks, John. And Jason, please.
We need to also be thoughtful about the fact that this dynamic is going to be really different in a 7-person council. I'm just thinking about how this is going to play out differently. And I'm not even sure. I just know it'll be very different than it is now. I mean, essentially, now you as yourself are one of the 5 votes. And so this is a very different dynamic. I don't even know I'm not even trying to say anything more than that. Just think about it, because it's going to be different for sure. I think 2 years is kind of arbitrary. I guess I'll just say that. I'm not sure. I see both sides. I think there is advantage to sort of having different people doing it. And there's going to be 7 people on the council. There's 6 city councilors. So maybe there's enough choice in that. I think in some of our prior councils, like that, honestly, with a smaller group of people, could have become quite problematic, actually.
Oh, thank you, Jason. All right, so we've got. Does anyone else want to or have something to add to the conversation about limiting the number of terms of a council president? I do hear that there's division in the group, so we will potentially take this to a vote if there is a motion and second, which would be, does the committee recommend, I could say limiting the council president to two terms or not limiting the council president's number of terms. I wasn't sure if we'd settled on a number or if we should just address whether or not to add term limits at all first and then set a number. So open to either of those questions, but this was my initial wording. Anyone would like to call that question?
I guess I'll call the question for sake of discussion.
All right, is there a second?
Second.
All right, any further discussion? And Zachary, please go ahead.
I mean, council president, I think there should be a limit of some sort. That way someone can't just run it like over and over again. But then again, like, you know, at the same time, I don't know if there's been any issues with just leaving it as it is with no term limits. So I'm not like super experienced about this. I would ask Cook or someone else who's already kind of served the position.
John or Jason, do you have any experience with someone overstaying their welcome with a number of terms, not just the number of years already in their term?
I don't.
I was going to say, Jason did it for 2 terms under me. In history, I know Nick Wilson, Craig Dirksen did it for multiple terms. Nick Wilson did it for multiple terms. Brian Moore did it for multiple terms. Nobody ever in all those years came up and says, wow, I can't believe that you did that. Now, in the general public, okay? Now, one counselor that didn't want that person has come forward, yes, because this is where it gets into very political, is that person wants their name on the resume when they're running for mayor to say they have been council president. And so that's the issue that I run into by, if the rest of the council doesn't feel that person even should be council president, and now all of a sudden all they want to do is use that council president as their resume to run for mayor, that's where I come into all of this.
I was going to say something similar, just that it depends on who you're asking. There have certainly been members of the council who felt like they wanted a different result. And we may even have gotten feedback tonight from just one of those types of people.
Zachary, does that answer your question?
Yeah, a little bit.
Great. Any further discussion? All right, we'll move into the vote. A yes is for no term limits to council president. A no is to yes term limits on council president. Any questions about that? I know, John, I know. All right, Carol Krager.
I say no term limits.
Well, then you want to vote yes.
All right, let's rewrite the
Wait a
question. Let's
second.
I'm gonna rewrite the question just a little bit, but we're not gonna go through the whole thing again. Does the committee recommend limiting the council presidents? Yes says yes, we want to limit. No says not limiting.
No.
Thank you, Kara. I'm sorry, everybody. I really am. Derek, please.
No.
Jason.
No.
Michelle's not with us. John Cook.
No.
Karen Emerson.
Yes.
Lindsay Murphy.
No.
Margaret Doherty.
No.
Nathan Jackson.
No.
Tony Simpson.
No.
And Zachary Claremont.
No.
All right, with a vote of 9-1, this passes. So council president will continue to exist without term limits, but still with a revised term of 1 year. And then we have one more question around council president to look into, and this would be around the ballot. So let me just pull up the exact wording of the charter for everybody, because this is a little esoteric. Okay. So here's president of the council. So at the first meeting of each odd numbered year, so this will be changed, it'll be the first meeting of each year, the council by ballot, this is what we're thinking about changing, shall choose a president from its membership. Then we have the duties. Okay, and then basically if somebody stops being president, council president, leaves office for whatever reason, then a new one is elected. But really we're talking about that very first sentence, the council by ballot shall choose a president from its membership. I think the proposal on the table, and Karen, please jump in and clarify when I'm done, is to move this from a by ballot to a by public nomination and election at a meeting. Karen, anything you'd like to add?
No, but yes, that's the language I'm hoping for.
Great, thank you. And John Cook, please.
The word you just used, public nomination, I would worry about, because to me that means the public citizens get to nominate it. And to me, the council needs to nominate it.
Excellent point. Thank you, John. Nathan, please.
So I have a question and a point. I'll start with the point, but so on planning commission, at least, we also have the nominate, accept nomination, then vote that I think Karen's proposing. I will say there's still stuff that goes on behind the scenes as far as people soliciting support. So if the main goal is just to bring out the politics behind the scene into the light, I don't know that it's going to accomplish that. But if there's other concerns, I would be happy to hear them.
Thank you, Nathan. Way to bring up the political world. I appreciate that. Tony, please.
I just had a quick question. Are we going to change the language in this section too to take out that physically and mentally and unable?
Yes, this was actually,
isn't it?
yeah, this was the exact section that we were just talking about. It's just, they sandwiched everything together, but it didn't make sense to talk about it in the order it's presented here. Okay. Does anyone else have strong feelings one way or the other about changing the ballot process or the election process, council president? And Karen, please.
Well, I just want to clarify, it isn't just to prevent or to attempt to prevent the serial meeting from happening and the communication. But assuming that it didn't happen, I don't want someone to get elected who really doesn't want the position. So doing the nomination and the acceptance of the nomination means that, yes, I really want the position. It could open up conversation as to why the person wanted the position. It could create it could have conversation going on so that they could explain why they want the position. Yeah, it just was really awkward to watch the vote. I know nobody wants to call it a secret vote, but what was happening was secret to the public until the pieces of paper were added to the packet of information, and you could see who voted for whom.
Thanks, Karen. And Jason, please.
I think Karen's point about someone accepting the nomination is totally reasonable, and maybe that's a step that could happen during the meeting and still vote the way it's currently done. So I guess I don't want to assume or say that it can only be one way or the other. So I just wanted to say I think that's valid. I don't there's not been a lot of deliberation, and I guess that'd be what I'd be curious about the rest of the committee's sort of comments here would be how much sort of public deliberation would you want to see? I think that in the past, the sense has been, the thinking has been that may harm relationships that don't need to be harmed, potentially. I understand the sort of public interest too. So I don't know that, I don't even know what I think about it yet, but I'd be really curious to hear what people think about weighing and balancing those different things.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you, Jason. John, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm up for campaigning on the dais. And that's where it would go. And basically they're trying to convince, I know Karen's trying to prevent them from doing that ahead of time. And I get that, but doing it on the dais, I think is worse, just because hard feelings. And, you know, I would say most of the elections, people just live with it and they said, oh, darn, I didn't get it. But they didn't go and ask for who voted for who, you know? And so you moved on. And so from that standpoint, I don't want to create this issue where there's hard feelings that you're going to live with the next 2 to 4 or 6 to 8 to 16 years, you know? And so it's very difficult. Now, I will say, and we removed this when we elected Jason twice, is it used to be the person that had the longest time on the council felt that they were council president automatically. And that happened in my first term. It didn't take a couple weeks when the rest of the councilors are saying, dang, why did I vote that way? You know? And so I think it's moved away from that, and nobody really thinks about let's vote the person in that has the longest time on the council to who they feel would do the best for them. And I think that's where the difference is to me. But to actually campaign on the dais, I'm not a big fan of that. I just think it puts too much bad blood in.
Thanks, John. Carol, please.
Yeah, I was interested in the process that Karen brought up. So let's say you've got 6 counselors and 3 of them are interested. So how do you nominate one and ask for any other nominations and acceptances and then do the vote?
Yes, you would, anyone who was interested could either nominate themselves or could have gone behind the scenes and asked someone else to nominate them. Generally would be how it would work. And then maybe the second person that's interested could say, well, I'm interested too. And then, yeah. Okay. And so you'd end up with, I don't know, if you had 6 counselors and 4 of them were interested, they could all nominate themselves, or 2 of them could be nominated by their buddies. Or... anything else, Carol? No, that's it. I think there will still be some talking behind the scenes with that. Thank you. Margaret, please.
I guess the question I have, and it's more because I'm not experienced with this end of government, but it just makes sense that you would talk to somebody, you know, ahead of time, thinking that they would be a good person or whatever, and saying no. I mean, I know you can't do that as a council, because then, you know, you run into quorum issues. But again, I don't like the idea of, you know, arguing in front of, you know, on the dais. But on the other hand, is there another way to do it that's a little more subtle? I think Karen was kind of talking about that. And is it, I mean, I hate to say this, is it really that big of a deal that people would actually go at each other to get it? I don't know.
Oh, good points. Thanks, Margaret.
So I guess I'm just kind of looking to, you know, it doesn't look good if you're going to have that kind of controversy. It's a little different when you've got issues versus a person and a personality. So I don't know how you deal with it other than, you know, kind of doing it behind the scenes.
Absolutely. See, Karen, you did have your hand up before I go to Jason.
Just that it really is an item of business, just like any other item of business that's taken care of, and it should be in the public. And I mean, I don't think you necessarily have to say a whole bunch of negative things about why you don't want to elect somebody, but the idea was that maybe somebody who was nominated could say why they were interested in the role.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Margaret. Jason, please.
Well, I think Margaret raised a couple of issues, and particularly we don't want a serial meeting happening, and I do understand kind of what the concern is there. I think that may happen around this subject anyway, or that kind of like extraneous discussion. So I don't know. I mean, Shelby, I actually think that's maybe just a broader issue in general around this particular topic. I'm not really sure how to deal with that. I don't, to the question that someone asked, and maybe it was Margaret, like, is it really that big of a deal? There's been a lot more energy on this in the last 8 or 10 years than I think we all would even want to see. So yes, unfortunately, I guess.
Jason, you also raised an excellent point, which is not all problems are right for a charter solution, or even can be solved with a charter solution. And this may fall into one of those categories, because I'm also seeing a lot of that dissonance with how to avoid those behind the scenes meetings. Tony, please.
Yeah, I agree with Karen's points, but also I think a mitigating factor now when we're switching it to a 1-year term, even if somebody doesn't get the position that they wanted, they're not stuck with that person for 2 full years. It's only a year. And I think if someone does have seriously just desperately wants to be president and doesn't want another person to be president, I don't think that conflict dynamic is going to be that different for the position than it would be for other issues, because generally if people bump heads, they bump heads. So I don't think that position would really be the thing that pulls everything to a head. If they're not going to get along, they're not going to get along, whether it's talking about parking changes or parks and recreation, they're going to fight. So I think it would be just as well to have those conversations, kind of on the podium or the dais, as you said, and just kind of let people say why they want the position. And I think that could help the public see, because if somebody just wants a position to be on their resume for when they want to mayor, if they're being fake, it might be nice to have them be fake in public so that both the council and the general populace gets to see that.
Thanks, Tony. All right, so we're gonna do Zachary and Lindsay, and then I'm gonna break in again. So Zachary, go ahead.
I think, because you guys were talking about like statements for like when you get elected, like you're doing elections within the council for president of city council, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so as of now, like all of it's kind of like behind the scenes, right? Or so you're saying like where you're talking with each other, it's not really in public eye, or
It's not so much that is happening as much as it can happen, but it may still happen even with the point that's been brought up by several folks is that still could happen even with this requirement. It doesn't alleviate, it may not lead to a solution to the problem that's been presented.
Okay, I think that having a mission statement because you already have a mission statement when you run for it, right? Or not really?
No, you don't have a missions because you're not running really for council president. It's not like you're not campaigning in the same way as you would for a seat.
Yeah, but it's still like a position of authority, so you'd be giving a reason for why you'd want it, right?
I don't believe that doesn't currently happen. So one of the pieces that's on the table right now is that in this nomination process, then someone could give the reason for why they would like to be council president.
I think it's good to have that debate and sort of have a reason to do that in front of like the public eye, maybe, I don't know. And then they do a vote after, rather than just all behind the scenes or not really like in front of everyone. There still could be behind the scene things happening, but at least if it's in the public eye, then it seems like it would be, something everyone can hear everyone's individual opinion about if they wanted to.
Thanks, Zachary. Jason, please.
I just want to, remind everybody from a context perspective, and Karen certainly knows this, and Margaret probably, and John, like people that have been in elected office for a while with a small group of people on your council or school board or whatever, like you spend hundreds of hours with these people. You know more about them than they may recognize about themselves. This is, and I guess this maybe is me making a little bit of a ploy for like, we don't need both to air our dirty laundry nor state the obvious about someone to make the case about why they would or wouldn't be good at this. I mean, I hear Zachary's statement and my reaction is like, when you're an adult on a city council or a school board and you've spent hundreds of hours with someone, like if you have any smarts in your noggin, you don't need a long description or dissertation of how they're going to do the job. Or, I mean, this is not a blind thing. I guess I just want to make that clear to people.
Thanks, Jason. And Lindsay.
Just to throw it out there for a thought, because, you know, we do talk about trying to make the charter less prescriptive. What if we say that the council has to have a president, the president serves for one term, and it's up to the council to figure out how that person is elected or nominated, and then the council decides every year how they want. But I guess I'd like to hear from Jason and John and how that's going to work out in reality, to leave it at the council's discretion in terms of, it just feels like a little bit minutia. I mean, it's not, but I do wonder if this is at that line of let's let the council decide and not have it prescribed in the charter. So just something to think about.
Yeah, so in this case, it would be set by probably council rules. So it would be something that the council would decide upon during their council rule setting, which is required in the charter. But there's some consistency there, or as one of your recommendations has been to require council to make council rules. So there are two, I guess, proposals then on the table. One would be to amend the voting process to be nomination election, and a second one to be to amend the voting process to say council to set their own voting process during their council rules session. Karen, since you're the one who brought this up, do you have a preference for which question gets called?
I am fine with these. I think it's the second one you just said, that just removing ballot from the charter and letting the council determine how they want to do it.
Great. So I am retyping as fast as I can. Jason,
If that was a moving by Karen, I will second it. And I would want to thank Lindsay for being creative and smart on this.
Yes, thank you, Lindsay.
I just kind of want to say that I like the creativity within the space, and some of the stuff is a bit hard to digest, and it's like, should we vote on it or should we let council vote on it? But yeah, I think that I don't even know if we need a vote, because I think it should be up to council if, you know, they're deciding the rules for how it's set, maybe.
I do decide whether or not to vote based on if there's anybody who is in opposition, and this one did have a lot of conversation, so I am still going to do the roll call vote. Although this one could be unanimous. Don't have a great sense of the temp. John, please go ahead.
So basically, you by voting one way or another, you're just removing the word ballot from the charter, and the charter won't talk at all about this, is what you're stating, correct? So the charter will say that council rules will provide. So, I mean, to me, that those are different.
Those are different. So I was under the impression that what we were saying was that council rule, that the charter will remove ballot and say that council rules will set the election process. I think we should still say something to what the election process is. Leaving that completely blank seems like a missed opportunity. I'll go with that. So I heard us first from, or a motion from Karen, a second from Jason. Is there any other discussion about this question, which would be, does the committee recommend amending the voting process to require council to set their voting process in their council rules? Wow, that is amending the council president voting process. Karen, please.
Well, I'm just wondering, would it be better to actually say what the sentence would be, and the council will elect a president from its membership?
Our general policy is on this committee has been not to set the language, but to come up with the concept, and then we'll take the language. There's a lot of changes that are going to be made to that particular paragraph. So I'd like to stay with our usual process. Great question. Carol, please.
Yeah, so are we still saying that at the first meeting of the year, business meeting, they will elect a council president?
Yes, that will not change because we have decided that every year there will be a new council president.
Okay, but when are they going to vote on their rules? So the previous council will vote on those rules, because
that's kind of a timing problem for those that have never done this.
That is a timing problem.
That's where I was going with my question. Sorry.
So right now, the rules do state that at the first business meeting of, I mean, it's not really a problem because it's the same problem we have now, right? Because does the council? Oh no, it's not.
No, so it does create a timing problem because the rules are generally not adopted until February-ish, March,
February,
sometimes give council kind of a chance to get their feet under them a little bit because it's usually tied with goal setting. And so the idea is give council some time to kind of get settled and then to adopt ground rules and goals together. So it does create a timing issue because you basically have January, February-ish without a council president.
That's true. Let's see, Karen, please.
The goals and rules are set every other year though, right? Aren't those for 2 years?
Yes, so this would be a timing issue every other year.
But is it really? If you put it into effect for 2 years, it will.
You just use the old rules? That could work.
Well, it applies twice.
Yeah, you could use the old rules apply for the next 2 years. Still makes a timing issue once the charter goes into effect. John, please.
I have a problem of using a prior council's rules to rule my current council.
Yeah. Granted that there is generally overlap, but sorry, Zachary, please go ahead.
I would just like to apologize for, interrupting a bit earlier when I said, and I kind of like didn't raise my hand. But I would just like to say, I feel like what could really help is when we're voting for, city council president. It's just like before they vote, they also vote for like how they want to set up the process. I don't know.
So that is an option that they could set their process on the dais before voting on their council president. Karen, please.
Just also wondering if it could be an ordinance instead of rules.
Could be, although at that point, I guess the council could also change the ordinance if they disliked a previous council's ordinance. Just more tedious, I guess.
Yeah, so it could be by resolution, ordinance, or even just by motion. There is no requirement for what type of document would be required. So council could, at the first meeting, they could adopt a process either by resolution, ordinance, or motion. They could adopt a process and then immediately follow that with adopting a council president.
Let's do that.
Great. 30 seconds, curiously typing again. Okay, so in this version, does the committee recommend amending the council president voting process to require council to set their voting process prior to the vote for council president? A yes vote says, yes, I would like to amend this to give council the discretion to set their voting process prior to the vote for your council president. And a no vote says, no, I don't like that. Zachary, please.
I put a motion to vote on this.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Jason?
Do we need to say that they will both set their voting process and then vote? Or is that just plain obvious, or Shelby will fix that in wordsmithing?
We'll fix that in the wordsmithing. Noted, and if this passes, it will be fixed. Any other discussion? All right, Carol Krager.
Yes.
Derek Lawson.
No.
Jason Snyder.
Yes.
John Cook.
No.
Karen Emerson.
Yes.
Lindsay Murphy.
Yes.
Margaret Doherty.
Yes.
Nathan Jackson.
No.
Tony Simpson.
Yes.
And Zachary Claremont.
Yes.
All right, with a vote of 7-3, this does not pass. I'm kind of torn on whether or not to continue this discussion around this issue. If we don't continue this discussion, we will default to the current language that is in the charter, which is that it would be a balloted vote. And I'm curious if the folks who voted no, if it's because that you prefer the balloted vote and that prescriptive, or you just didn't like, or you don't like the balloted vote, but you didn't like this solution. And Zachary, I do see your hand, but you were not one of our no votes, so I want to give them preference first. So Nathan, please go ahead.
I guess my no mostly comes down to it's starting to feel too complex to me. And as soon as things start to get complex, there's more room for politicking to go on. And I just didn't like the idea of there now, in addition to there being behind the scenes, generation of support for the presidency, there's now behind the scenes discussions on what rules shall we use so that I can get the presidency.
Is there any less complex way that you would have preferred? Or is it that you're comfortable with the ballot language or the language as ballot as it currently states?
I would like us to find a solution along these lines. I don't know what that would be, but I liked the direction we were going.
Thanks, Nathan. Derek, please.
Just fully recognizing Karen's desire for more transparency. My position on it is that these folks were already voted on. They're already on the council. This is adding an additional process. I'm not sure what public transparency looks like in this case. That I don't see it as simplifying anything or solving anything necessarily, I guess is my point, where in the current form, how the council determines who's going to be the president, the council president. The purpose of having additional transparency would be to safeguard the public in some sort of fashion, right? To give the public input in such a manner, and there is none. This doesn't solve that. So if we put it out in front of everyone to either, as Zachary put, a mission statement, or as Karen's asking for people to express to the public why it is that they desire to have that position, there's no feedback loop there. In the case of the public, the council members can say anything that they would like to say, but there's nothing for me to do with that information other than to, I guess, put it in a footnote potentially. So I don't see it as solving anything, and I see it as a superfluous conversation entirely. So that would be my position on it. So I'm not horribly opposed to it. I just don't think it does anything.
Thanks, Derek. And John, please.
I agree with both Nathan and Derek. And to me, it's adding a layer of complexity that we don't need. I think the way it worked before, and I just don't see a big need for change. Not saying that there couldn't be something different. I don't see something jumping out to me. I do not know of my 60 plus years of any council president that says, oh darn, I wish they wouldn't have elected me. And so the fact of saying that person has to accept, they can still resign from it right after the election, and then there's a new election. So there's already things in place. So I don't see having to change it.
Thanks, John. And Jason, please.
Well, I was almost a no vote, so I guess I'll just share that I was right on the line. I was willing to go along with it for sort of to be a get along guy, but I kind of do think it's a solution in search of a problem, if I'm being totally honest. So I'll just state that.
All right, given the reasons behind the no's and the on the fence, I don't see this passing with consensus this evening. So I would like to move this conversation along. And Zachary, please.
I know we are missing someone. Is it possible to do a revote when they're back and like inform of what happened that way?
And this could always come up with a new question at a later meeting, but we would not recall this same question because someone is missing.
Oh, okay.
And
well,
John,
that's a bummer.
John, please go ahead.
It would still fail 8-3, even if the other person did. So it wouldn't matter.
Thanks for the math. We have 15 minutes left this evening, which is not a lot of time to really get into another topic. And we kind of reached a fork this evening. I'm kind of unclear about whether we should move forward into resignation requirement or how vacancies are created, given that those both, we spent a lot of time kind of dovetailing into those. So actually interested to hear from this group for our next meeting, if you'd like to start with vacancies or the resignation requirement. I mean, ideally we'll get through, so at our next meeting, let's just talk about our next meeting and what our schedule looks like. Because maybe it doesn't matter.
I think we should start with the resignation requirement, because that, at least in my mind, that drives the part of the second discussion, but I guess you could argue that both ways.
You really, and then welcome to the argument happening in my brain. So our next meeting is crowded, and I'm going to send you as much material as I can to try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of this week, so we can try to move through some of these questions, because they tend to be a little more on the prescriptive, esoteric. There's kind of already a generally agreed upon answer, but we may want to make our own spin on it. And those include vacancies. So both how a vacancy is created, how a vacancy is filled, the resignation requirement, as well as the eligibility to run for office in the city of Tigard. Ideally, we would get through all 4 of those topics, or at least through 3 before the end of our next meeting at the end of June, which would put us in really good shape for our meeting in July, where our real question around city officers is which city officers to include in the charter. The overall language is usually pretty prescriptive around what the roles of those city officers are. So if we had to move one topic into that meeting, we should still be okay. And then looking at our August meeting, fees and preambles, and then finishing touches. John, please.
So you don't feel we can do resignation requirement in the next 10 minutes?
We can give it our best college try.
I move that we remove the resignation requirements altogether.
Second.
For discussion, does everyone understand when we say resignation requirements, what that means? I'm seeing some head shakes. So right now in the Tigard City Charter, if you are currently sitting in a city official position, or city elected official position, mayor or city councilor, and you want to run for the other position, and generally that is someone who is sitting as a city councilor and wants to run for mayor, but the charter does offer it for either direction. You are required, and your term would not conclude before the term of the other office would begin. So if you were on the off year and you were elected to a 4-year term, but the mayoral election is after year 2 or during year 2 of your term, the charter requires that you resign your office or submit a resignation letter that will resign your office before the beginning of the mayoral term, before you can run for that office. This is very unusual. It's the only charter I've read that has it, but it is a requirement, and it was brought to the electorate several years ago, and did not pass as a charter change. Although, as you can hear me talking about it, it becomes much more confusing the more times you use the word term.
So to piggyback on that, to elaborate, so the resignation is irrevocable once it's made. However, it does not have to happen before the election. And so generally it is effective at the end of December, when everyone who's done it, to my knowledge, has done it. It's effective at the end of December, even though it's made in July, August, whatever. So it's irrevocable whether you win or lose the election. If the person wins the election, it's a moot point, because under Oregon law, you cannot hold 2 elected offices at the same time. And so the only thing that it really serves to do is essentially punish somebody who wants to run for mayor and loses, because now the person has given up half of their council seat and has not been elected to mayor. So that's a little more context for it.
Thank you, Shelby. John, please.
Yeah, as Kim said, she's read 20 some charters, and this isn't in one of those. I've actually 30. Okay. Well, I probably read over 60 of the charters. I found it once in addition to Tigard. So of the 241 cities, I know of 2 cities that it's in. So it's very obscure. If you look at all the cities around us, you know, here's the downside. So people that want to understand is you've got 2 counselors running for mayor. Okay. One, they both have 2 years left, or 2 years left on their term. So, okay. One of them wins and they're the mayor. The other one wins and they're a counselor. Okay. They now have to deal with that person that ran against them, and they're a counselor on that person's mayor for the next 2 years. But the citizens voted them in for 4 years anyway. They wanted them to be a counselor. So it's happened in Sherwood. It's happened in Lake Oswego. It's happened in Hillsborough. It's happened in Tualatin, and it's happened in Beaverton. And those are just the local cities that I know it's happened in the last 10 years since I've been elected. So it's very common. The councils didn't implode under those situations. And since everybody in the state does it other than us, it's something in search of a problem that we really didn't have.
Thanks, John. Jason, please.
I was just going to add a couple. I mean, the main thing I was going to add actually is that while many of the things we've been talking about don't seem to happen very often in Tigard or seem like edge cases, your last 2 mayors have both had to resign mid-cycle to run. So this is happening all the time, and probably, just from my standpoint, not good policy. Shelby, you said something that confused me though, just because I know of a number of situations where in particular people are serving in more than one elected office at a time. Are you saying in one unit of government? We've got school board members that are in the legislature all the time. In fact, we have one now. What was that in reference to, or can you clarify that a little bit?
Right. So city offices. So yes, unit of government. So you can't be a counselor and a mayor at the same time.
Great. Good clarification. Thank you. Carol.
Yeah, I think this is a horrible thing and we need to get rid of it. And one problem that I worry about is, what if several counselors run and they all lose, and then you've got, you know, a new mayor, potentially a new council. So we don't want to be in that position. And this The only plus I could see would be maybe you wouldn't have to do a special election, but you can always appoint for, the 2-year time. So I say get rid of it.
Thanks, Carol. Is anyone in favor of keeping the resignation requirement? Anyone at all? All right, so this committee recommends that we remove the resignation requirement. Yep.
Yes.
Great. And we have 3 topics for next meeting. Thank you, John, for pushing us to work on that this evening. That's really helpful. So back to in our last couple minutes. So back to our schedule, we will be talking about vacancies and eligibility for office. Then we'll be talking about city officers. We have fees and preamble, and then finishing touches on the charter. We will also, before our next meeting, get a new charter shell out with all of the changes that we've made. And so that'll be sent out. And again, same process. If you have questions, amendments, please send them to us between meetings so we can try to address as many of those as possible offline, especially if they tend to be like add a comma here and there or clarify something. We'll talk about them during the meeting, but it's just helpful to have that heads up. Jason, please.
Yeah, just as I'm reflecting on where we've been and what we've gotten done, one of the things that still is nagging at me, and I think Mayor Lube is struggling with this a little bit too. And I know personally, both Mayor Cook and myself also struggled with a little bit is the time demands on the mayor. And frankly, the money in particular from both the federal and state government that we give up by not having a full-time mayor. And I don't feel like we've actually vetted that question and had that discussion. And I actually think was that going to happen somewhere, Kim?
Actually, we hadn't planned on having that conversation. We kind of viewed it based on all the other charters as not a charter question. So Beaverton's really the only charter that calls out that they have a full-time mayor, and you may be familiar with some of their salary information for their mayor, and not every person would even consider that enough to be a full-time position. And their charter goes out of its way to also say that you're allowed to hold outside employment, which leads me to think that while it is the only charter I read that says full-time in it, it doesn't actually mean full-time based on how the city's policy. So it really becomes, in our opinion, when we were talking about it behind the scenes, more a policy question, because it really has to do with what is the salary set at, because any councilor or any mayor could choose to be full-time if the salary met their needs.
Yeah, that would not be the current way that's set in Tigard is not realistic. I guess I actually think this is a topic this group should be taking up just because of how much money's on the table and how negatively that impacts the community overall, and people that don't want to think about that or are not seeing a connection need to better, I think, understand that because it is significant what the expectations are. And while I don't think Beaverton's prohibiting other employment, their mayor is spending, and I think the expectation is that whoever's in that role is spending a full 40 hours a week, which in my busiest month as mayor, I think I logged 120 hours, which would not even be at the full-time mark. It was usually between 85 and 120. So I just think it's worthy of this group to at least consider it.
Noted. Margaret, please.
I'm not quite sure I want to have that discussion. We had another 50,000 people in Tigard. I think we can have that discussion. If all of a sudden we could grow more than we are because we're so boxed in land-wise, there might be discussion. But I just don't think we're big enough for that, to be honest with you. So that's it. My opinion. It's almost 7:30.
It is. So on that note, and to hone in on something that Jason just said, there has been so much work that's been done by this group, and there was so much work that was done by this group this evening. And I deeply appreciate the thoughtfulness that everyone brings to these conversations. So please, everyone, have a wonderful evening. Enjoy the last bits of sunshine, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.